This is Democracy Watch. Mark, we have a chilling story here wherein the White House is apparently pushing Texas Republicans to ahead of redistricting to make sure to basically consolidate as many seats as they can. First and foremost, is what the White House is doing cause for concern from your vantage?
Absolutely. I mean, what the White House wants is the state of Texas to engage in mid-cycle redistricting, which means redrawing the maps in 2025 and 2026 for this election and for the next two elections, having already drawn new maps after the 2020 census. So that's what they want. They want a gerrymander that is more effective than the last gerrymander, because let's be clear, the current maps in Texas are gerrymandered against Democrats. The current maps in Texas are gerrymandered against minority voting rights. And so what the Trump administration wants them to do is to double down, triple down, quadruple down, and just make the maps that much worse, that much less fair, and frankly, almost certainly that much more illegal.
How is it allowed that a state can redraw the maps mid-cycle? Isn't this something that states can only do in the immediate aftermath of the census?
No, actually, this was a controversy that came up in the early 2000s when Tom DeLay, the congressman from Texas, proposed mid-cycle redistricting in Texas, and they did, and that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court blessed the idea that states are free to do this if they wish. And like I said, that is a case out of the state of Texas. What's egregious here is that what Tom DeLay was doing was taking a fair map, a map that had been drawn when there was sort of bipartisan control of Texas, and making it a Republican gerrymander. What they want to have here is a map that was drawn entirely by Republicans. Okay, this was a Republican gerrymander to start with.
Right.
And now what the White House wants them to do is go and more extremely gerrymander the map to make it even less politically fair and to make it more violative, almost certainly, of the Voting Rights Act and the U.S. Constitution. You know, it's interesting that this is all happening right now because as we speak, the state of Texas is in trial in federal court over their last redistricting map. My law firm actually represents some of the plaintiffs who are suing that over the current congressional map, which is itself a violation of federal law and of the U.S. Constitution. So the fact that the White House is like, look, you know, you did okay, but you could do even better for Republicans is disgusting. And it is something that Democrats need to be prepared to fight with every tool available, both inside of Texas and in other states.
You say that this is in violation of the federal law and the U.S. Constitution, but we have federal law and the U.S. Constitution in place, and yet we've seen these aggressive gerrymanders in states like Florida and states like North Carolina. And so if it was allowed to take place in those states, is there some concern that it will also be allowed to take place in Texas?
There is that concern, but let me be clear. The violations in Texas are of the Voting Rights Act and the constitutional provision against racial gerrymandering. The claims against the state of Texas in the congressional litigation are much more similar or very similar to the claims that prevailed in Alabama, as you recall, where Alabama was forced to create a second majority black district. In Louisiana, where, as you recall, Louisiana was ordered to create a second black district. Now, in Texas, it involves a lot more seats than just one seat.
Right.
Because
if I'm not mistaken, there was a bunch of there is not enough Hispanic representation along in some of those South Texas districts along the Rio Grande. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's only part of it. I mean, the Republicans did a number on this map in all sections of the map. So certainly the Hispanic areas around in South Texas, but also the way in which they gerrymandered around Austin, the way in which they gerrymandered around Houston.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moving pieces to what Republicans did there. And just to be clear, the Republicans have lost a redistricting lawsuit every decade for like the last 3 or 4 rounds of redistricting. Like they are recidivists at violating the rights of Texans in how they draw their maps, both their state legislative maps and their congressional maps. But the fact is they are also a fertile ground for what the White House is peddling. because you have extreme partisans who run the state of Texas. Now, they have to be careful because number one, they could change the map and it could get struck down, and then you could have court drawn maps and all of that, and they've got to worry about that. Just look what happened in Alabama and Louisiana. But they also have to worry that because it is already so gerrymandered, if they gerrymander it further, they may expose some of their Republican incumbents in a wave election to being defeated, right? At some point, you stretch your gerrymander so far that you get a little thin with Republican performance. And the next thing you know, you wind up losing a bunch of seats. So I'm sure that is the push and pull that's going on right now between the congressional delegation and the White House. Suffice to say, there is almost certainly no Republicans speaking up for the people of Texas in that conversation. It is entirely a political conversation.
Just speaking about Texas more broadly, I feel like Texas for decades now has felt like the prize, like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for Democrats. How do you view Texas, not just the legislature, which is, of course, getting more and more extreme? Ironically enough, Texas had a pretty moderate legislature just up until a few years ago, and now it's gone the way of this MAGA Republican Party, and so it's no longer moderated at all. But how do you view Texas in the broader scheme of things? Do you still have faith that Texas at some point in the future, because of changing demographics, because of changing political affiliation, may still be gettable for Democrats?
Absolutely. Look, I think that the Republican fortunes in Texas remind me of the line from Ernest Hemingway about bankruptcy, where he went bankrupt very slowly and then all at once. In politics, things tend to move slower than you would expect until they move faster than you expect. So yes, the blue shift in Texas has moved much slower than people thought. There were people I remember talking, in before Obama's election, but then in the immediate wake of the election, that Texas might flip blue or be very purplish very, very soon after. And it's moved slower than we expected. But like I said, the way it works in politics is a state seems to be solidly in one camp until the dam breaks. And once the dam breaks, it tends to break big. So look, for example, in Arizona, which was a solidly Republican state, 2 Republican senators, always voting Republican for president, a Republican governor. And then all of a sudden, in one fell swoop, it now has 2 Democratic senators, a Democratic governor, and competitive for president. Another state like that, Virginia for a long time was solidly Republican. Then all of a sudden it flipped and now it is solidly Democratic. So I don't know whether it'll be 2026, whether it'll be 2028 or 2030. It's a fool's bet to try to predict when it happens. But eventually, at some point, the first domino will fall in that state. And when it does, I expect you will see a lot of dominoes falling. And that's why I think there is some concern, I suspect, at the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. On the one hand, they like this White House idea. They like more seats. On the other hand, they have to be worried that they stretch themselves too thin. And the next thing you know you'll see a whole bunch of surprise outcomes in the state of Texas, particularly in a year that could wind up having a little bit of a wave.
Right. If Texas does opt to go through with this plan, are there any Democratic states that are poised to be able to counteract what the Republicans are doing? I remember when Nebraska was kind of testing out this idea of making it a winner-take-all state, because they knew that the state more broadly would go red, and so that means that instead of splitting electoral votes with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, they would basically pass a law to ensure that it's winner-take-all, which virtually guarantees that Donald Trump would have won that state more broadly. And Maine was there to counteract and say, if you go winner-take-all, so will we, and that would virtually assure that Kamala Harris would take all of that state's electoral votes. And so is there some counterbalance to what these Texas Republicans are doing? And I say that with the caveat that some of our big blue bastions are prevented from doing that because we have independent redistricting commissions and have kind of neutered ourselves in some of our biggest weapons, which is a state like California or a state like New York.
Right. So I was going to mention the state that you currently reside in is probably the biggest potential gain for Democrats, and that is California. California has a nonpartisan independent redistricting commission. If they were to move away from that and have the legislature redistrict in the way in which, other states do, you could see Democrats gain a number of seats. That's not to say that California will, but that would certainly be one place. Other states that have similar either processes or traditions would be New Jersey and Virginia. Now, Virginia currently has a Republican governor, currently has a split legislature, but there are gubernatorial elections there. New Jersey obviously has a Democratic-controlled process. You mentioned New York. New York, there is less to be gained in New York than most people think. Democrats actually did pretty well last time. There are probably a seat here or there that if there was further redistricting, maybe flip, though I suspect that those districts flip in any event in the midterm. That's Mike Lawler's district in particular, which is just north and west of New York City, and maybe one other. But really, California is the state that right now Democrats control the state legislature, and if it had a different redistricting process, you could imagine it gaining more seats than Texas could gain for Republicans.
Do you think in an instance where Texas did announce that they're going to seek mid-cycle, mid-decade redistricting, that California could or should flirt with this idea of disbanding the Independent Redistricting Commission, which I believe would have to go to the voters anyway, but could get the process started and say basically what Maine said to Nebraska, which is if you want to, this is like the fuck around, find out. If you want to really engage in this process, then we have weapons at our disposal as well.
Yeah, look, so this may turn off a whole bunch of your viewers, so I apologize, but I've been on record. Like, we cannot have a system in this country in which Republicans aggressively gerrymander and Democrats default to redistricting commissions. Okay. Like, we can debate the merits of having a nationwide system of nonpartisan redistricting. Fine. All for it. Great. But I opposed Virginia, a state where I live, engaging in a nonpartisan process when Democrats were in power, because there aren't that many states where Democrats have the ability to draw maps.
Right.
And, you do not see Ron DeSantis, losing a second of sleep in Florida over his gerrymander in violation of the state constitution. You do not see the Republicans in North Carolina worrying at all about public opinion or sentiment as they gerrymander that state almost beyond recognition. You do not think for a second that in Alabama or Louisiana, that the Republicans who denied black voters fair districts cared at all, other than the fact that they eventually lost in court. And certainly in Texas, Republicans are going to do what they think is in their political interest, and they're not going to worry about what fairness is. So I am frustrated at times as someone who litigates redistricting cases, as someone who, cares deeply about democracy and process democracy issues. We cannot have a world in which Donald Trump is able to wield power because Democrats are playing by a different set of rules. And I know there's a lot of frustration about this across a range of issues. And I sometimes am leading that crowd, and sometimes I am defending Democrats from what I think are unfair attacks. And in the area of redistricting, I'm not here to tell Governor Newsom or the Democrats in California what to do in their state, but I will say, at some point you cannot have this two-tiered system. And in reality, we have that two-tiered system.
Yeah. Look, I don't think you're going to get as much pushback as I anticipated when you were, offering up that caveat in the beginning. I think that Democrats unilaterally disarming is probably the biggest weapon that we use against ourselves in these instances. You don't have Republican states where they good government themselves basically into obscurity, and that's what Democrats have done by basically kneecapping ourselves in these big blue bastions like New York and California. If the shoe is on the other foot, which all you have to do is look at Texas and Florida, these people aren't offering up independent redistricting commissions. They are figuring out how to gerrymander their states to within an inch of their lives, and that's why you have an extreme gerrymander by the Republican legislature in Florida, and Ron DeSantis says no, we have to go even more extreme, and so I'm gonna shut down this gerrymander to give you my own gerrymander so that we can squeeze one more seat out of this. We don't have that happen in blue states, and And we need to, because the reality is that we can offer up good government solutions until we're blue in the face, but then we're just relegated to the minority and just allow Republicans to run roughshod over our majority in the first place, which I don't think anybody is for here. But look, you have been a leader in pointing this stuff out, and for Democrats to get as aggressive as they need to get to be able to preserve some power, especially in the face of a Republican Party that will stop at nothing to do it. So highly recommend for everybody who's watching right now to help elevate Mark's voice, which is urgently needed right now, especially in the face of a failing legacy media that's perfectly content to both sides everything to death. One small step we can all take is to subscribe to his YouTube channel, a new YouTube channel called Democracy Docket. So it doesn't cost anything to subscribe, but it helps elevate his voice, which is urgently needed right now. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.